Today, we return to a quiet spring evening in 1876, when a young gentleman climbed into bed and never got back out. No screams, no break-in, just a glass of water, a locked room, and a slow, silent death. Some say it was suicide. Others point to his wife, the maid, the stable boy. But one truth lingers. He was poisoned, deliberately, cruelly, and never avenged. So lean in as we descend into the chilling mystery of Charles Bravo. He's been poisoned. The words slid out of Dr. George Harrison's mouth like cold fog, whispered across the oil-lamp-lit drawing room of the Priory. Charles Bravo lay convulsing in bed, his eyes wild, lips twitching, breath shallow and wheezing, like his own body was trying to cough up a secret it couldn't quite say. His wife, Florence, stood frozen. The maid bolted from the room. The servants muttered. And Charles? Charles was dying very slowly. Not quickly, not cleanly, not like poison kills in penny novels or dramatic stage plays. No, this was real, a prolonged, almost performative agony. 3 days of excruciating internal warfare as some invisible hand tightened around his insides. By the time the laudanum wore off and the spasm stopped, it was too late. Charles was dead. The doctor had seen poison before. But this was deliberate. A dose chosen with intelligence, with cruelty, something arsenic adjacent, metallic, ancient. He hadn't eaten anything strange. No obvious wounds. Just a man, alone in bed, screaming that he would not say who did it. And then he died. But here's the part that will keep you up tonight. Everyone in that house, his wife, the maid, the butler, the stable boy, had a reason to want him gone. And every single one of them claimed innocence. Convincingly, calmly, almost theatrically. No fingerprints, no confession, no suicide note. Just a crumbling gentleman in Victorian England, poisoned under candlelight in a locked room, while all the suspects stood close enough to hear him scream. And the most disturbing part? No one was ever arrested. 1876 Balham, a sleepy, tree-lined village on the fringes of London's Reach, just far enough to escape the stench of the Industrial Revolution, but close enough to be fashionable. If you squinted, it looked idyllic. Brick manors, horse-drawn carriages, men tipping hats, women hiding arsenic in their corsets. You know, the usual. The Priory stood like a genteel fortress on a high road, 3 stories tall, ivy climbing the walls like green veins, and a cast-iron gate that practically whispered, "We are respectable people. We do not air our rot in public." But inside, it was a pressure cooker of silent grievances and locked-up rage. Victorian England was a twisted funhouse mirror of manners. Appearances mattered more than truth. Marriage wasn't about love. It was a business merger in lace gloves. Women were trapped. Men drank to feel superior. Servants heard everything and said nothing. It was a civilization obsessed with control, hiding every deviant impulse behind porcelain smiles and tightly cinched waistlines. The house itself was cursed with silence. Not literal ghosts, but emotional ones. Florence Bravo, previously Florence Ricardo, had bought the Priory after her first husband accidentally drank himself to death in South America. She returned a widow at 30, independent, wealthy, and whisper-ridden. That combination didn't sit well with London society. Women weren't supposed to have agency or bank accounts or opinions about sex, especially not beautiful, scandal-shadowed ones. Florence's staff watched her with a kind of nervous loyalty, as though afraid of what she'd do next or what might be done to her. Servants had seen things. Footsteps at night, raised voices behind closed doors, a steady stream of brandy bottles. And then Charles Bravo moved in. He was supposed to be her redemption, her return to polite society. Instead, he was the final nail in her coffin. Balham wanted order, morality, a neat headline. But what it got was a murder so domestically grotesque, so morally entangled, that it became the O.J. Simpson trial of the Victorian era, complete with anonymous tips, newspaper sketches, and a courtroom that smelled like lavender water and suppressed hysteria. Every detail of the setting, every drawing room, every whisper, every shadowed corridor was steeped in one truth. Behind the facade of civility, someone had planned a murder with the precision of a clockmaker and the patience of a snake. Let's talk about Charles Bravo, the man at the center of this tangled Victorian spiderweb. Solicitor by trade, social climber by nature, the kind of man who knew exactly how to wear a cravat, but couldn't quite figure out how to be a decent human being. He was 30 years old when he married Florence. Handsome in a spends too much time looking in the mirror sort of way. Sharp cheekbones, a steady gaze, an ego large enough to host a garden party on. On paper, Charles looked like a respectable match. Upper middle class, educated, good prospects. But peel back even one layer and the stink comes crawling out. Charles was, to put it bluntly, a gold digger in gentleman's clothing. He married Florence not for love, not even for lust, but for power, her wealth, her home, her status. He believed the Priory was his rightful stage, and everyone in it, Florence, the servants, even the dog, his supporting cast. Control was his drug. He managed Florence's finances, told her which friends to see, monitored her medications. He even tried to fire her long-trusted companion, Mrs. Jane Cox, under the pretense that Florence needed to distance herself from improper influences. That's Victorian for, your maid has too much dirt on me. But Charles wasn't just a manipulative husband. He was also wildly insecure. His manhood, both socially and biologically, was a point of fragile obsession. Rumors circulated that he suffered from delicate health, a common euphemism for impotence. Doctors were consulted, tonic waters tried. Florence was poked and prodded by an endless parade of gynecologists who all seemed more concerned with her uterus than her actual well-being. And oh, the irony. In a world where men owned everything, Charles couldn't even guarantee an heir. That small, humiliating failure burned like acid in his psyche. He projected his shame outward, became cold, moody, controlling. He didn't just want to dominate Florence. He wanted to erase the version of her that existed before him. But Florence wasn't easily erased. She had survived an abusive first marriage, a rumored affair with a notorious doctor, and a society that treated independent women like broken clocks. She may have been outwardly compliant, but inside her simmered rage just as sharp and deadly as the poison that would one day kill him. And that's the cruel twist. For all his plotting, Charles Bravo died before he could finish rewriting her story. It began with a glass of water. April 18th, 1876. A calm, forgettable evening at the Priory. The household followed its usual rhythm. Florence retired early. Mrs. Cox was upstairs. The servants moved like silent clock hands through the corridors. Charles sat alone in the dining room, brooding over something, likely money or control, or his own inadequacies served cold in a crystal tumbler. At some point before midnight, Charles walked his bedroom, took a glass of water from the washstand, and, unbeknownst to him, drank his own death sentence. Within an hour, he was vomiting violently, his body convulsing as if being torn apart from the inside. Not the discreet Victorian feigning kind of sick, but howling, violent spasms. His skin was slick with sweat. His eyes rolled back. He begged the servants for help, begged, as his muscles tightened and his breath came in broken gasps. Dr. Harrison arrived quickly. His diagnosis? Poison. Most likely tartar emetic, a potent emetic containing antimony, historically used to induce vomiting or, more nefariously, slow and deliberate death. Now here's where it gets properly deranged. Despite being in agony, Charles refused to say who he believed had poisoned him. Not once. Not a name. Not even a cryptic hint. Instead, he said repeatedly, "I have taken it by accident." No one believed him, not even the doctor. But the man clung to that lie until his final breath, as if protecting someone, or perhaps preserving his own pride. 3 days. That's how long he lasted. 3 agonizing days. Muscles spasming, kidneys shutting down, tongue thick, skin pale, and all the while, everyone in the house walked on eggshells. No police, no inquiries, no confrontation, just long, tense silences between servants. A slow-motion tragedy. Florence stayed by his side at times, dutiful, quiet, but not weeping, not dramatic. Some said she looked relieved. And then he died. not in a grand crescendo, but like a candle extinguished by its own melting wax. Just gone, and now the house was filled with whispers. The doctor's diagnosis was clear. This was no foodborne illness. This was deliberate. The glass was never found. The poison? Discreetly administered, probably into that single, unassuming glass of water. And suddenly, everyone in the Priory looked like they had something to hide. The first crack in the foundation of a perfectly ordered life. And once that crack opened, the flood came. You could hear the guilt in the silence. After Charles died, the Priory became a stage set for psychological theater. Nobody ran. Nobody confessed. But everyone began shifting, like furniture subtly rearranged overnight. The maid, Alice, spoke in half-sentences. Mrs. Cox became strangely defensive. Florence floated through rooms like a ghost wrapped in taffeta. The house was full, but somehow colder, heavier, tainted, and the more investigators looked, the more the story fractured. There was no bottle of poison in Charles's room. No residue. No fingerprints, because Victorian times. But here's the kicker. The type of poison used, tartar medic, wasn't easy to get. It wasn't just lying around like arsenic for the rats. It had to be procured. Knowingly, thoughtfully. That's not murder in a fit of passion. That's premeditated. That's planned. At first, eyes turned to Florence. Of course they did. She had motive, control, resentment, emotional abuse. She had opportunity. They lived together. She had means. She was known to keep various medicines on hand. But she also had one thing that complicated everything, a uterus. And in Victorian England, that meant people weren't sure if she was dangerous or just hysterical. But then there was Mrs. Cox, Florence's fiercely loyal housekeeper and friend. She was conveniently present during every major event, always helping, always watching, and strangely evasive in testimony. She admitted to destroying private letters. She was suspected of tampering with evidence, but no one could pin anything to her. She was a perfect enabler, or perhaps the perfect co-conspirator. And then came the most Victorian twist of all. The stable boy had been recently dismissed, fired by Charles. Why? Because the boy had the audacity to speak to Florence without permission. That's how tightly Bravo tried to police his domain. The boy had a grudge. And access. 3 suspects. All with motive. All with opportunity. All under one roof the night a man was quietly and methodically poisoned to death. But here's the real brain melter. What if Charles poisoned himself? Yes, that theory was floated. Maybe an accidental overdose of a tonic. Maybe a failed attempt at self-medication for his condition. But no one believed it. Not really. Because Charles was too vain to kill himself. Too proud. Too aware of his image. Which left investigators staring into a void. Every answer unraveled into a new contradiction. Every lead doubled back like a hall of mirrors. There was no clear suspect. No damning confession. And yet one undeniable truth. Someone in that house murdered Charles Bravo. And they did it quietly. Elegantly. Perfectly. What do you do when the evidence evaporates? The investigation into Charles Bravo's death was less a case file and more a tragicomic opera. First came the whispers, then the tabloids, and finally the coroner's inquest. Because if Victorian England loved anything more than propriety, it was publicly dissecting private misery. The inquest became an open-air circus. Newspapers branded it the Balham Mystery, churning out woodcut illustrations of Florence with mournful eyes and Jane Cox looking ominously maternal. Every detail of their lives was picked apart. Florence's past lovers, her monthly prescriptions, Cox's loyalty, Charles's masculinity, the exact dimensions of a water glass. And just when you thought the story couldn't twist any harder, it did. The toxicologist confirmed the presence of tartar emetic, enough to kill a horse. It hadn't been in his food. It wasn't in the household medicine cabinet. It wasn't traceable to any pharmacy in Charles's name. But it was in his stomach. Too much to be a mistake. Too specific to be chance. So began the carousel of theories, each more desperate than the last. Theory 1, Florence did it. A classic. She was allegedly fed up with Charles's control and violence. She'd suffered in silence. She was tired of forced medical exams and snide remarks about her past. And perhaps, just perhaps, she decided to reclaim her autonomy the Victorian way by slowly, beautifully killing him. Theory 2. Mrs. Cox did it to protect Florence. Maybe she'd overheard arguments. Maybe she'd seen bruises. Maybe she thought she was saving her friend. After all, she admitted to disposing of letters and managing Florence's medications. She was evasive, maternal, dangerous. Theory 3. The stable boy poisoned Charles out of revenge. Fired unfairly, humiliated and angry, maybe he returned that night and doctored the water glass. It was far-fetched, but not impossible. Theory 4. Charles did it himself. Suicide? No. But self-medication gone wrong? Possibly. He had been taking a mixture of stimulants and aphrodisiacs to combat his sexual dysfunction. Perhaps he'd dose himself with antimony in hopes of a cure, only to miscalculate. But the doses were too specific, too fatal. This wasn't a man chasing vitality. It was a man being erased. And through it all, the most damning evidence was also the most elusive. Everyone had something to gain from his death, but no one could be proven guilty. 2 inquests, 2 separate juries, and still no verdict of murder. Just the uncomfortable purgatory of death by poisoning, cause unknown, in a house filled with motives. The poison had slipped through the cracks like a ghost in lace gloves. This is where it all starts to feel cursed. After months of speculation, interviews, and indecision, the second inquest finally detonated, not with conviction, but with a verdict so surreal it may as well have been written in gothic italics. Willful murder by a person or persons unknown. That's Victorian legalese for someone definitely did this, but good luck proving a damn thing. It was the closest anyone ever came to justice, and it was as hollow as an undertaker's smile. Florence Bravo, already unraveling under the weight of suspicion, social exile, and insomnia, sat in that courtroom like a woman being slowly buried alive in public opinion. People whispered about her in the streets. Clergy refused her communion. Children crossed the road to avoid her carriage. She had become what every Victorian woman feared most, a scandal with a pulse. And then the breakdown. Florence fled the priory, left it behind like a blood-stained dress. She moved into a smaller house, severed ties with a society that had once welcomed her, and, perhaps most telling of all, began to drink. Not socially, not daintily, not a nip before bed. No benders, brandy for breakfast, gin in the bath. The descent was fast, unapologetic, and terrifying. Mrs. Cox, always the anchor, tried to stay by her side, but something between them had snapped. Maybe it was mutual paranoia, maybe guilt, maybe both. Eventually, they parted ways, and the quiet between them was louder than any accusation. By 1878, just 2 years after Charles's death, Florence Bravo died of alcohol-induced illness. 33 years old, once a symbol of female resilience, now a cautionary tale. Her obituary barely mentioned the poisoning. No tributes, no sympathy, just silence. And in that silence, a chilling truth. 3 people went into that house, but only 1 left intact. And even that might be a technicality. The priory was sold, the servants scattered, the furniture auctioned off like cursed relics. But the questions remained, humming beneath the floorboards, echoing off the wallpaper. Why did Charles never name his killer? Why did Florence never defend herself properly? And most damning of all, why did everyone involved choose silence over truth? You don't need a ghost story when the living are this haunted. It's hard to solve a crime when the evidence is ghost-shaped. Technically, the case is closed. Legally, it's a dead end. But narratively, psychologically, existentially, oh, it's wide open. Charles Bravo's death is a perfect Victorian mystery. Not because it's unsolvable, but because it's infested with too many answers. The poison wasn't exotic. The opportunity was intimate. The suspects were familiar. Yet nobody could or would talk. And so the theories fossilized, became lore. A locked room mystery without the locked room. Just a glass of water, a slow death, and a house full of actors too terrified to finish the scene. The official outcome: no prosecution. No one was tried. No one jailed. Florence was publicly humiliated but never formally accused. Mrs. Cox returned to anonymity. The stable boy vanished into the margins of history. But the real trial happened in the drawing rooms, in the gentlemen's clubs, in the suffocating pages of the tabloids. Florence was crucified by innuendo. Her reputation became her sentence. In Victorian England, being suspected of poisoning your husband was only slightly less damning than being a divorcee with opinions. And yet, there was never a shred of hard proof. Here's the worst part. Everyone had an alibi. Everyone also had motive, which means the case didn't collapse due to lack of clues. It collapsed under the weight of too much plausible darkness. It's the psychological equivalent of floor caving in not from a single crack, but from the rot in every beam. Even the police gave up. The file was quietly archived, like a cursed manuscript you don't want to touch, but also can't throw away. Generations later, true crime obsessives, historians, even playwrights would revisit the story. They'd each pick a villain: Florence, Mrs. Cox, Charles himself. But none of them could make the puzzle click without forcing a piece to fit. Why? Because deep down, this wasn't just a murder. It was a war of identities. A house filled with people pretending to be something else: a respectable gentleman, a submissive wife, a loyal servant, until one of them snapped. And once that mask slipped, the others followed suit. Not out of malice, but out of survival. You don't need to believe in ghosts to know that the Priory was haunted. It still is. What do you leave behind when no one knows what really happened? Charles Bravo left no heirs, no will, no confession. Just a legacy of silence and suspicion. And yet, somehow, his death became immortal. Not for what it solved, but for what it refused to. The public was obsessed. The inquests were reprinted in newspapers across Britain and beyond. Florence Bravo became the anti-heroine of countless penny dreadfuls, whispered about in parlors and dinner parties. Victorian women feared becoming her. Victorian men feared marrying her. And the case? It started mutating, evolving. It stopped being about truth and started being about narrative. Depending on who told the story, Florence was either a feminist icon or a femme fatale. Mrs. Cox, a devoted protector or a domestic puppet master. Charles himself became a sort of gothic punchline, a man so controlling he micromanaged his own murder. Legally, the case changed nothing. Socially, it cracked the mask. Florence's fall from grace exposed the rot behind genteel society. That behind the lace curtains and orchestral soirees, you might find addiction, manipulation, marital rape, emotional warfare. The Bravo case was a proto-true crime saga, a public therapy session disguised as scandal. Even the legal system buckled under the pressure. 2 inquests, dozens of witnesses, hundreds of hours of testimony, and still no closure. The phrase "death by poison administered by person or persons unknown" became a sort of grim punchline for investigators, a bureaucratic shrug in the face of perfect murder. Writers devoured it. Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, even George Bernard Shaw. They all dissected the Bravo case like vultures in waistcoats. It's been reinterpreted as novels, plays, radio dramas, because everyone wanted to solve it, and everyone failed. Today, the Priory no longer exists. It was demolished in the early 20th century, bulldozed like a guilty conscience. But the story, the feeling of it, that claustrophobic, gaslit dread that maybe, just maybe, you're living in a house with someone who wants you dead, that never left. The Bravo case didn't give us answers. It gave us a language for unease, for the quiet violence of control, for the deadly power of silence, for the kind of murder that doesn't come with bloodstains or gunshots, just a bitter aftertaste in a glass of water. There's something especially chilling about a murder that doesn't scream. No blood-soaked floorboards, no frantic chase, no bullet holes, no butcher knife, not even a scuffle. Just a man sipping from a glass of water and dying slowly over 3 agonizing days, while the people around him smoothed bed sheets and adjusted curtains and said, "I don't know what you mean." It's almost poetic, and it's absolutely terrifying, because this is what real evil often looks like. Not a monster in the woods, but a household secret. A decision made behind the locked door of a parlor, in the rustling of a letter quietly burned in a grate, or in the slight hesitation before answering, "Would you like some tea?" The Bravo case survives not because it's unsolved, but because it made the ordinary feel dangerous. A husband, a wife, a servant, a sip of water, and a slow death. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to it. Because it asks the questions we don't want to answer. How many women are driven to the edge by control masked as care? How many victims are too proud to admit they're being poisoned? How many crimes go unpunished simply because they're too well-mannered? Here's the final grotesque irony. Charles Bravo's last words were, "I've been poisoned." But he never said by whom. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he did, and chose silence out of pride, shame, or spite. But either way, he died knowing he was part of a story that no one would finish. A story that would outlive everyone involved. A story that, even now, keeps whispering through cracks in old houses through the bitter taste of things we pretend are sweet. 1 glass, 3 suspects, 0 justice. We'll never know who killed Charles Bravo, but someone did, and they got away with it. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.